And during the 1980s, when did it actually close again, Angela?
1981.
1981. It was then clear, so there was an immediate sense of what do we do with this monument now? There were various attempts made. The land was cleared for a garden festival in the mid-80s.
1990.
Was it 1990? Okay. But the question around this area is one generally of a kind of urban regeneration and kind of obviously with the death of the kind of coal industry and shipbuilding as well. What do we do with these communities who are very tenacious communities? And this is actually a picture. Just met with Angela before and she reminded me. I thought this was an old historic picture, one Angela took. So there's been a real problem actually in reshaping these kinds of communities. And people are there and there's a strong sense of local identity and people don't want to move. So this area was...
Yeah, it's scheduled for demolition, but the people would move out, so it's 6 years and it's still not been demolished.
Very strong sense of local pride. However, there is there has been developments here. This was a Wayne Hemingway development. In direct contrast to those kind of original communities, these are kind of the classic imported middle class, I guess, kind of communities in terms of a kind of eco-development. Glossy, glitzy, seen as successful in direct contrast really to some of the traditional communities around, and this is literally facing the States. So this is an area of urban regeneration, social polarization to some kind of degree, quite a socially charged kind of area. And more than that, since its disuse, this has become a kind of very interesting ecological kind of area. This is literally around now, the States, has become a kind of mudflats. And it's become a breeding ground for all kinds of species. So here's the Stays now. There was also another part of the story was a fire. Again, lots of kind of informal, illegal kind of activity going on the Stays. It's provided a long-standing kind of platform since it's closed down for people actually kind of going onto the stage and using it for their own ends, their own means, their own enjoyment. And unfortunately, in one particular case, this enjoyment spilled over into a fire, and part of the Stays was lost. So. Some of the work we did, again, I'm not spending a lot of time talking about some of the more formal kind of work we did, kind of interviewing and running focus groups with people to try and establish the kinds of range of environmental concerns. So connecting back to our long-standing interest in how environmental and sustainability issues kind of get framed in a particular kind of urban context. And you can see, again, a real kind of complex mix of environmental issues shaping this kind of area. So it's a very kind of rich context to be working in. So here's another little video. Now you actually get to hear Wolfgang, if I can make it work, talking about the project.
The major project I'm currently working on is an engagement or an interaction with the Dunstan States, Gateshead around the corner. The Dunstan States is the largest wooden structure in Europe. It's a fascinating piece of architecture. A jetty which goes out into the water where the coal trains would offload their coal into barges on the river. At the moment, because it's derelict since about 30-40 years, it's also an environmental protected site.
You can't hear that, can
it's
you?
also a piece of industrial heritage, one of the few pieces of industrial heritage of this region.
People at the back are doing it.
And nobody knows what to do with it.
No, maybe you could say what you say if you...
But it's a piece of heritage. And how do we
sustain it? Do you want to...
I don't know if I can make it work.
Okay, well, don't worry. If you can't, then leave it.
Specifically looks at sustainability. I wanted to find out what sustainability actually means. What kind of level does it have? I thought an art project could be a catalyst to trigger this kind of discussion. And I picked the Dunstan.
Perhaps if you can come a little nearer, there's plenty of space if you can't hear.
Structure, which actually ticks a lot of the sustainability boxes in the sense of that you can take and ask questions about it. So what you see here is this is a part of the Dunstan States. The Dunstan States is made out of kind of frames, and actually I'm making a 1:10 maquette. It's approximately between 60 and 80 meters high. It's an enormous thing. About 10 years ago, a section of the Dunstan States got damaged through fire and is missing now. And what I do here in my maquette is I want to rebuild the missing section. So in a way, building the gap, physically repairing it in a maquette. But at the moment, we wanted to start the whole discussion by really putting an architectural scale sculpture on top of it. And we're using a material called aqualine, which is recycled plastic waste. So we're putting an enormous amount, 10 tons of recycled plastic waste on top of the stage in form of a huge cone. The material also looks like cone, which again kind of like links it back to the material which was the prime export here and what the jetty was used for.
Did people get that? The people at the back, did you kind of follow? I mean, he was basically leaving a little bit of the background that I gave you as well. I'm trying to. The reason for showing it really was to hear the project in the words of Wolfgang, and how he saw the project and how he saw the artistic role within it. And he was talking there about, and this was the original idea that we couldn't do in the end because we couldn't get enough scaffolding. It was just too big an engineering, too costly, too big an engineering job. So again, interesting. There's lots of kind of related lines of inquiry in projects like this. So how do you understand backwards a piece of artwork? And most of the kind of work will start with a kind of object. But actually to understand the jetty project and what ended up there, you need to understand all of these kind of side stories which are to do with costs and engineering and planning, to understand why the final artistic form is in a particular kind of way. So this was his original kind of idea. He was very keen to kind of bridge this kind of gap there, but as I said, we couldn't do it. And in one way, it's the other part of the problem he had when he was thinking about this, that he had certain doubts about it, was it just wasn't going to be very prominent. So the sense of actually producing an art object, and would this be enough, was another part of the kind of issue. So he came up in the end with this idea of a cone built out of the kind of the aqueduct, quite a lot of the aqueduct, as you can imagine. So where did this idea come from? Well, Wolfgang does, and if you read the book and read the interview, will talk about certain kind of reference points. So he talks about this Leamington glass cone. So for him, this was a kind of historical reference which might be meaningful to people. And interestingly, this was one of the tensions, I think, for Angela and I. So coming back to this question, what difference did it make embedding, connecting work of fine art with work of social science? Because in one way, if the historical referencing here is just a simple aesthetic object that's copied, what difference does the social science make? But as you read into the book and read what Wolfgang says, on the one hand, he'll throw this as a throwaway kind of reference. On the other hand, he says, actually, it doesn't matter, it's not important. It's not important what the object was. The object just needs to be there to attract attention and to encourage people to think, to see differently and think differently and engage with the stage in a different kind of way. So there's the actual kind of object. So again, following this kind of a line of inquiry, the story, the alternative story of the production of the piece is not so much the images of cone on a sunny day, of which you'll see many in the book. It's overcoming all of these kinds of material, legal, technical kinds of challenges to do the assembly of the sculpture, the amassing of all this aqueduct, and I think that's some of the things that you would remember here. So there's 2,200 sheets of 5 kilogram aqueduct. Cone took 9 days to erect, using apprentices from Gateshead College and the scaffolding company Mears. Each of the individual panels, which amounted to a total of 11.5 tons, including 3 tons of scaffolding, had to be handled up, manhandled up. There's the images there to the top of the stairs. Then they had to pictures of this. Following the mark out of the footprint of cone by the structural engineer, apprentices started the process of laying the spiralling conical pattern of full-size panels interspersed with 2/3 cut pieces and ensuring a continual even spacing. So this is from there's a chapter in the book talking about the kind of technical side of this. So after the structure reached about 2 meters high, the scaffolding contractor came on site to erect the central scaffolding tower, which reached a height of just under 9 meters, allowing the apprentices to build up the full height of the cone, etc., etc. So actually the intersection of the different kinds of skills here are absolutely essential to understanding how cone came about. There's Angela and part of the research team. And here's the guy who had to stand by through the whole of this on the boat in case anyone kind of fell in. And the amount of negotiation just trying to get on there and having the health and safety around trying to do this, including men in boats, was really quite extraordinary. certainly a lot of learning in terms of planning a project from my point of view. So that's what we end up with. And there was a whole set of events, I've got some slides I'll show you in a moment around this, and forms of public engagement. But at the end of it all, and there were lots of conversations with the Baltic Art Gallery around having exhibitions there, and so on and so on. And when we came to the end of the project, as I said, the unusual thing about this is trying to understand what happened in the project during the project and actually produce a piece of work which is not only analytical, kind of backward looking, but also it somehow is going to continue the conversation going forward. So how do we think about this kind of work? How did we start to think about it? What do you find if you read in the book? Well, on the one hand, you can discover in there a kind of fairly conventional narrative of fine art and fine art practice, where Wolfgang, the famous international artist, responds to a particular kind of site and particular kind of issue, and in really kind of creative and kind of ingenious kind of ways, produces what actually really are beautiful, creative, ingenious kinds of structures which can be read and enjoyed within that framing very nicely. And again, I've mentioned a few times through this tour the links with architecture, and here's a famous quote from Louis Kahn, modernist architect, talking about materials. You think of brick, for instance, and you say to brick, what do you want, brick? Brick says, I like arch. So you say to brick, look, arches are expensive. I can put a concrete lintel over you. What do you think of that brick? Brick says, I like arch. So this kind of narrative of actually artistic production for its own sake almost, to produce objects of beauty. And that's there, I think, in Jetty. Interestingly, this was put up for one day in order to have a photograph of. So this was a piece that Wolfgang was trying to find a place to show it, and he still wants to find a place to show it. But in order to complete the project and complete the book, we assembled it for one day. Angela was there during the construction to have beautiful photographs taken in. So that's part of this story. But of course, there are other parts of this story. You can go back and I haven't done, but I could write articles placing this within my earlier work around this kind of complex history of architecture. Having done this for sustainable architecture, Angela and I have got an article planned around mapping this in relation to sustainable art. So again, from within the social science kind of realm, we can use this material to think about sustainable art and cities in a particular kind of way. We can do that, and there's a little bit of element of that in the book. We can mobilise, can we still call them fashionable kind of arguments around assemblage and assembly theory, and talk about the kind of complex social, technical ordering and reordering of people, places, materials, nature, in order to understand and to make Jetty happen. We can think interestingly about that, and there's an interesting story there, I think. We can talk about social complexity and do kind of social mapping, again within a social kind of science frame. And here's an original mapping of the kind of actors and agencies, institutions that we found, which we did in kind of very early work that Angela did, mapping the kind of social organisation of interest in the area. And then we can say what happened through the process of Jetty was a whole set of new actors and institutions and agencies were introduced into kind of conversation. And we can do some interesting kind of social mapping around the project. Again, there's a small element of that in the book. That's a theme that can be developed.